Greetings, everybody. This is Dr. Jonathan Cox, your resident race scholar, here with another mini lecture on race. Now, although activists, scholars, and everyday Americans of color have been talking about and pushing for anti-racism for generations, recently more and more people, particularly white Americans, have started exploring anti-racism more openly. So, what is anti-racism? In this brief mini lecture, I'll help explain the concept of anti-racism and provide some helpful tips for you to be able to use to engage in anti-racist behaviors and practices yourself. Anti-racism is an active process of identifying and eliminating racism in all of its forms. Anti-racism involves changing systems, structures, policies, and practices so that power is redistributed and shared equitably by all. One book that has been getting a lot of attention recently, given the discussions happening nationwide about racism, is How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. Let's watch a short clip of Dr. Kendi discussing his book and the main premise behind what he writes.
My name is Ibram X. Kendi, and I'm the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist. And this book really seeks to show that the contrast is actually not between racist and not racist, but the contrast is between racist and anti-racist. What I think many people who self-identify as not racist don't realize is that really over the course of history, nearly every group of people that we actually consider to be racist have also identified as not racist, whether that's white supremacists today or segregationists of yesterday. And so really, each of us should be striving to be anti-racist, not necessarily striving to be not racist, because really that's a term primarily of denial, and it's a term really that doesn't have much meaning. But it does mean something to be racist. When someone says that there's something wrong with a racial group, they're being racist. When someone says there's nothing wrong with any of the racial groups, they're being anti-racist. When someone supports policies that create and reproduce racial inequity, they're being racist. When someone supports policies that yield and create racial equity, they're being an anti-racist. And these aren't necessarily identities or fixed categories or tattoos. Literally, what we're doing in each moment determines who and what we are in each moment. And people change from moment to moment and from year to year. And I think we should identify people based on what they're saying and doing, because no one ever becomes racist or even anti-racist.
A main thrust of Dr. Kendi's position is that things are either racist or anti-racist, and people either engage in racism or anti-racism. Identifying as not racist is merely a method of denial that continues to perpetuate racism. Everyone must strive to be anti-racist. Now, some people think that this is a more extreme position to take on racism, while others think that it's the only way to really understand racism and anti-racism. Regardless of your thoughts, Kendi's framework is a useful tool for critically examining how racism works in society and conceptualizing how we can begin to take meaningful, impactful steps towards true racial equity and eliminating racism. Now, one thing that people are becoming more aware of as they have conversations about racism and are being challenged to look within to see how their own experiences with or complicity in racism is that they likely have been having mostly superficial interactions with regards to race. Now, a consequence of superficial interactions is othering. Now, the term othering describes the reductive action of labeling a person as someone who belongs to a subordinate social category defined as the other. The practice of othering is the exclusion of persons who do not fit the norm of whatever that social group is. There are many examples of othering that we could point out. Patricia Hill Collins, a prolific sociologist best known for being a pioneer of Black feminist thought, discusses the term voyeurism, wherein the lives of people of color are only good for entertainment value. In voyeurism, privileged people don't relate to the less powerful, but are really only interested in seeing how the different live. Similarly, bell hooks, another notable scholar, talks about eating the other. Now, in this concept, some whites believe that exposure to different people or different cultures will give them more intense pleasure than anything from the ordinary world of their own racial group. Hipster racism is a form of cultural appropriation and covert form of othering. Now, in hipster racism, college-educated whites who often live in gentrified areas and claim to have friends of color co-opt elements of different cultures or people of color for their entertainment value. Hipster racism also includes expressing racist ideas under the guise of being urbane, witty or ironic, educated, liberal, or trendy, and it represents a passing familiarity with people of color or mass consumption of their culture without equating to true racial understanding. Finally, we can highlight enlightened exceptionalism, which is the act of accommodating individuals or friends as the exception to the stereotypical rule without changing or modifying broader beliefs regarding racially minoritized people. For example, a white person might say of their one Black or Latinx friend, "Oh, you're different from everybody else, you're not like them." Anti-racism necessitates moving beyond these superficial othering interactions. One way to do this is to work to become an ally. An ally is just a member of a dominant group who works to dismantle forms of oppression from which they receive benefits. So, what then can you do to begin being anti-racist in your own life? Now, it's important to always remember that anti-racism is a journey. It's not a destination. You never arrive. You're always learning and working towards the goal. Now, being anti-racist looks a little bit different for white people than it does for people of color. For white people, being anti-racist evolves with their own racial identity development. They must acknowledge and understand their privilege, work to change their own internalized racism, and interrupt racism when they see it. For people of color, on the other hand, it means recognizing how race and racism may have been internalized and whether or not it has been applied to other people of color. Now, let's go through a few practical steps that you can take to start your own anti-racist journey. First, what can you do interpersonally at the individual level in your everyday interactions? Start by acknowledging that race and racism exist. It sounds simple, yet research, news stories, social media, and pretty much any type of interaction we can think of continually shows us that many people simply do not believe that racism is still a problem. Acknowledge your own privilege or how race constrains you. White privilege is often a difficult concept for white Americans, but here's one way you could think about it. White privilege doesn't mean that your life as a white person is always easy. It just means that race is not one of the things that's making it harder. Be aware of your own racism and hold yourself accountable. What racist or racially insensitive jokes might you tell? What comments are you making? What stereotypes and biases do you hold about people of color? Honestly examine why you act or behave a certain way towards people of different races than you. Speak up against racism, against racial insensitivity, against inequality, and particularly in situations where you have more power or on behalf of people with less power or privilege than you. Take the burden of disruption off of people of color. Hold others accountable. Courageously disrupt racism in conversations with friends, family, social media followers, and other people in your life. Ask them to stop telling racist jokes or saying racist or racially insensitive things. Talk with others about racism. Read about race and racism. Step out of your comfort zone enough to put yourself in places where you will engage with people who are different from you. All of these practical steps are great things that you can do interpersonally to enact anti-racism. As I mentioned earlier, anti-racism looks a little bit different for white people than it does for people of color because of the ways that race and racism work. Now with that, here are some tips specifically for white and white passing people. White Americans, remember that you bear most of the burden for anti-racism because of white privilege. It can be a tough lesson to learn, but one that is invaluable in the fight for racial equality. Accept the fact that you may not ever fully understand the experiences of people of color, but you must make honest, continuous attempts to try. Be willing to risk your own privilege and resources on behalf of people of color. This is where being an ally is really important. You want to make invisible privileges visible. Lastly, move beyond superficial interactions. Actively pursue close relationships across difference and across the color line. Finally, people often only think about racism in terms of individual interactions and beliefs, but racism is so much more than that. Racism is also systemic and structural, which has further reaching consequences than what any one individual can say or do. With that in mind, here are some things that you can do to practice anti-racism at the institutional and structural levels. Take charge of your own education on racial issues. Seek out information that can help build knowledge about race, racism, and racial disparities, and don't just rely on people of color. Google is an awesome tool. Support businesses that are owned or run by people of color, and don't support businesses that lack diversity, particularly in upper levels like management and other decision makers. Advocate for moving from diversity to inclusivity. Now, inclusivity means removing barriers that keep all people from participating equally in society, whether that's in the workplace, neighborhoods, a small group you're a part of, whatever it is. Strive for equity. Equity, a more intentional and impactful idea than equality, means making sure that everyone's voices are heard, valued, and recognized accordingly. For example, it doesn't do much good if an organization is deploying resources to recruit diverse candidates, but does nothing to invest in creating an inclusive workplace to retain them, or for a school to increase the number of underrepresented students, yet assume that they will simply fit in with the current culture with no changes. Hold politicians and other policymakers accountable. Don't vote for people who aren't actively addressing racial issues through anti-racist practices. Support policies that aim to remove barriers to equity through intentional consideration of race. For instance, support race-conscious policies meant to level the playing field or improve access, like affirmative action. Support policies that empower people of color to access full rights, like those that make voting easier and not harder. Or eliminate policies and practices that result in racial disparities, like policing practices that result in the disproportionate killing and incarceration of people of color, or educational funding models that rely on property taxes. Finally, if you have children or plan to have children, send them to local schools, or don't pull your children out of these schools. Instead, advocate for more inclusive changes that make the school better for all children and their families. These are just a few practical ways that you can start to implement anti-racist practice in your own life at the interpersonal level and the institutional and structural levels. Now, to paraphrase a well-known proverb, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one footstep. Now, anti-racist thought and action, that's a journey, it's not a destination. So start your journey now with a few small steps and see where they take you.